So I want to revisit acceptance this morning and talk about it as an antidote to our suffering. Um, and I want to start with a quote I really love from Sharon Salzberg. Many of you know of her and her writing, and she's one of the early um, people who brought um, Vipassana insight to America in the 70s. And she says, quote, accepting suffering doesn't mean that it goes away or even that it gets better. Too often we conflate the idea of, quote, being spiritual, end quote, or the idea of acceptance with a new agey cliche that we simply say no to suffering. We can learn to feel discomfort in a far more pure and direct way without the additional burden of distorted thinking. But I still maintain that some things just hurt, close quotes. And, and we often talk about the Buddha's first noble truth states that life invariably involves suffering. The Pali word is dukkha. And that could be suffering, unsatisfactoriness, stress, any number of states of discomfort. And it includes the obvious forms of suffering, pain, physical pain, emotional pain, loss, aging, fear of death, and so forth. But even as I've talked about in the past, some positive experiences can and do contain the seeds of suffering because things we enjoy are impermanent, they're unreliable, and they don't last. And very often we suffer because they're impermanent, unreliable, and not lasting. You know, when we grasp at what is pleasurable or push away what is unpleasant, we create suffering for ourselves. So what that comes down to is that suffering comes from resisting reality. Suffering comes from resisting seeing and accepting things as they are, not as they want them to be. And as you often hear me say, acceptance means acknowledging reality as it is in the present moment, not denying, not repressing, not avoiding what is happening, or not holding on, clinging tightly to what is happening if it's pleasant. And it doesn't mean we have to like everything or be passive. Acceptance is an active process of opening to the truth of our experience. With acceptance, we drop our struggle against what is. We drop the rope, as you often hear me say. It's a metaphor we often refer to here. We drop the rope. We no longer fight with reality. We no longer try to change reality. And the result of that acceptance is a profound sense of peace and freedom. And that's the paradox. We may not like what's going on, but by accepting it, we bring into our experience greater peace and freedom. You know, and when I'm able to do this, when I can catch it, I literally feel it in my body. I feel it as a weight coming off of my shoulders. There's a lightening of the load. You know, you remember the sutta on the two arrows. The first arrow is the initial pain. And that's what Sharon Salzberg was referring to in that quote. We cannot avoid it. But simply put, acceptance removes the second arrow. It stops us from experiencing the pain of the second arrow. And paradoxically, acceptance is what allows real change to happen in the face of our suffering. So when we accept the present moment as it is, not as we want it to be, as it is, we are no longer stuck in reactivity. And reactivity, by definition, is a form of suffering. And with the clarity of acceptance, we respond to life more skillfully. And importantly, we have more choice in how we act. We're not just pushing against things, trying to change things that we don't like. We have choices. Acceptance takes us out of our story of how things should be different, of how things should be the way we want them to be. And then we are opened up and free to accept and embrace life as an adventure rather than a series of problems to be solved. You know, when we're constantly seeing everything in a way we don't like, then everything becomes a problem, everything becomes a challenge. And acceptance, we cultivate it through a non-judgmental awareness of what's going on right here, right now in this moment. And we practice acceptance with the little stuff first. Unpleasant sensations, unpleasant feelings, everyday frustrations. That's what kind of begins to teach us the tools or provide us with the tools to open to the harder stuff when we get hit with it. So we don't want to just let the little annoyances go by without accepting them, or let them go by and say, "Oh, I wish it weren't so," or "It's so awful." It's like this now. It's like this now. That becomes our mantra. And an important part of this path, of this direction of the path, is self-compassion, because it also means accepting ourselves as we are, just as we are, warts and all, not as we want to be. And it's not always an easy task. Our ego is screaming at us, "No, I don't want to accept that. No, I don't want to believe that I really have that trait. No, I don't want to believe that I really am that way." And so it means acceptance in this sphere means accepting ourselves with kindness, with compassion. And with practice, over time, we learn to say yes to the totality of our experience. What the Taoists call the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows of this human life. This is the path to freedom and peace that the Buddha promised. The Buddha's fundamental teaching was that pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. Suffering is optional. You've heard that quote many times. That yes, the first arrow hits. We all experience the first arrows, and Sharon Salzberg alludes to that in the quote. But the suffering that we add onto it is optional. There is a way out, and that way is acceptance, saying yes to reality as it is. And in no way here, please, I'm not suggesting that life becomes perfect this way. It's never going to be that. Pain is still pain. And not just physical pain, but, as she referenced, the greater pain sometime of loss, separation, and despair. But when we stop resisting it, when we stop trying to disallow it, we actually suffer less. We find this unshakable willingness to be with whatever arises. And in those moments, when we're truly accepting what is, we touch into this timeless, boundless freedom that is the true legacy of all of us if we just yield to it, if we just practice it. This is the promise that the Buddha made to us. So we start where we are with the small moments, with the small challenges, and then we gradually move to the more challenging aspects of our life. But we say yes to all of it. And in doing so, we discover the peace that is possible. So acceptance is an antidote, not to the inevitable pain of life, but to the additional suffering that we pile onto the things that we don't like, or the things that we like that are impermanent and are going to go away. So, excuse me, I'm going to stop there and let's talk about acceptance.